Okay, so this one I've genuinely been sitting on for a while because every time I start thinking about it, I end up in this weird place that's somehow both terrifying and kind of beautiful at the same time. And I cannot decide which feeling wins. Like, what actually happens to Earth when we're gone? Not during some apocalypse, not while it's happening, after. When the last human being has died and the planet just continues. Without us, no cleanup crew, no transition period, no handover, just the Earth doing what the Earth has been doing for 4.5 billion years, completely indifferent to the fact that the thing that called itself the dominant species is no longer around to have opinions about it. And the thing that gets me every time I come back to this is that we're not guessing here. We're not extrapolating from nothing. We have actual data. Because humans have already left places, abandoned cities, evacuated zones, industrial sites that got too toxic to inhabit, places where we walked away and nature got the keys back without being asked. And what happened in those places is one of the most fascinating and honestly deeply humbling things I've ever looked into. So let's start there. Because I think the small-scale version of this story makes the planetary version land completely differently. In 1986, the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine was evacuated in under 3 hours. 49,000 people, gone essentially overnight. They left behind apartments full of furniture, wardrobes still full of clothes, schools full of open textbooks, hospitals with equipment still on the tables. An amusement park that had been scheduled to open for the May Day celebrations had opened for exactly 1 day before the evacuation order came through. The Ferris wheel never ran again. And then the city just sat there, empty, sealed off, for decades. And what happened to it is extraordinary in a way that I don't think photographs fully capture, even though there are a lot of photographs. Within 2 years, plants were growing through the floors of apartment buildings. Mosses and grasses first, then shrubs, then actual trees pushing up through the linoleum and the concrete. Within a decade, trees were growing through rooftops, roots working their way through foundations. The forest at the edge of the city slowly, methodically, moving inward, block by block, like it was reclaiming territory it had always considered its own, and was simply waiting for the temporary inconvenience of human occupation to end. Within 20 years, the forest had reclaimed entire streets so completely that you could walk through Pripyat today and genuinely struggle to find the road underneath your feet. The buildings are still standing mostly, but they're not ruins in the dramatic collapsed sense we tend to imagine. It's more like the forest is quietly, patiently, almost politely digesting them, incorporating them into itself. The apartment blocks look less like abandoned buildings and more like strange concrete trees that happen to have windows. And the wildlife. Within years of the evacuation, wolves returned to the exclusion zone, then lynx, then brown bears, then Przewalski's horses, one of the last truly wild horse species on the planet, were introduced and thrived. Bison populations rebounded. Bird species that had been declining across the wider region stabilized inside the zone. The diversity and density of large mammals inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone is now higher than in the surrounding inhabited areas, despite the radiation. Despite the contamination that we evacuated 49,000 people to avoid. The animals looked at a radioactive forest without humans and a safe forest with humans and chose the radioactive one. Every time I come back to that fact, I find it a little more difficult to feel neutral about it. Now scale that up. Scale it from one abandoned city to the entire planet simultaneously. Scientists have actually modeled this in detail. There's a whole field of speculative ecology and future geology dedicated to exactly this question. And the timeline of what they find is genuinely one of the most fascinating things I've read in preparation for this video. Within hours of the last human dying, automated systems start failing one by one as their maintenance cycles lapse. Within days, power grids collapse as the automated processes that keep them running lose their human oversight. Within weeks, water treatment plants stop functioning. Cities flood or dry out depending on their geography. Within months, the nuclear power plants that lost their cooling systems start experiencing meltdowns, which sounds catastrophic and in the short term absolutely is. But here is the perspective that changes how you think about it. In the geological record, nuclear contamination from every plant on Earth failing simultaneously would register as a thin layer, an isotopic anomaly, something a geologist a million years from now might find, note as interesting, and move on from. The planet has survived asteroid impacts that released more energy than every nuclear weapon ever built fired simultaneously. It is not going to be meaningfully troubled by our power plants. Within months of the last human, domestic animals begin to scatter. Pets left, inside die. The ones outside begin the process of reverting. Cats, it turns out, do fine almost immediately. They were never that domesticated to begin with. Dogs struggle in the first generation, but the survivors start changing fast. Within a few generations of feral living, their behavior shifts. Within dozens of generations, their morphology starts shifting. The selective pressure that we applied to them for thousands of years, breeding for traits that were useful to us, reverses almost immediately when we're no longer there to apply it. Nature starts selecting for what works in the wild again, and what works in the wild looks nothing like a golden retriever. Within years, every major city on the planet is showing visible vegetation reclamation. The Pripyat process, but everywhere. Simultaneously, at scale, vines pulling at facades, roots working into foundations, grasses breaking through asphalt at every crack and expanding outward. The cities don't collapse immediately, they get consumed gradually, the way a forest consumes anything left inside it long enough. Within decades, most roads are unrecognizable without excavation. Not structurally destroyed necessarily, just buried. Covered by decades of leaf litter and soil accumulation, and root systems that treat asphalt as just another substrate. Within a few centuries, most wooden structures have completely rotted. Steel structures are deep in the process of rusting. Glass, which we tend to think of as permanent, is actually relatively fragile on geological timescales, and most of it will be gone within a few thousand years. Within 1,000 years, a person dropped into a major modern city would struggle to identify what they were standing in without specific knowledge of what to look for. The outlines of foundations might be traceable. Certain materials that resist biodegradation would still be present, but the city as a recognizable human construct would be largely gone. And here's the part that I find genuinely staggering every time I think about it. The structures that last the longest are not the ones you would expect. The pyramids of Giza will still be clearly recognizable as artificial constructions in 100,000 years. The basic geometry is too precise and too massive for erosion to fully erase on that timescale. Mount Rushmore will still show faint traces of the faces in several 100,000 years. The alteration to the rock is deep enough and large enough to persist longer than almost anything else we've built. But the thing that will last longest of all as evidence that something happened here, the thing that a geologist or alien archaeologist a billion years from now would most reliably find, is not our buildings, or our monuments, or our fiber optic cables, or our satellites decaying in orbit. It's our chickens. Specifically, the bones of the domestic broiler chicken. We have bred this animal so comprehensively, so specifically, so far from its natural form, and so optimized for rapid muscle growth, that its skeleton is unlike anything that has ever existed in the natural world. The broiler chicken cannot survive in the wild. It can barely support its own weight. It exists entirely as a product of human intervention. And we produce approximately 65 billion of them per year. Their bones are accumulating in landfills and sediment layers and processing facility sites across the entire surface of the planet. In the fossil record of the deep future, the domestic broiler chicken will be one of the clearest and most widespread geological markers of the human era. More legible than our skyscrapers, more durable than our highways, more globally distributed than any monument we have ever built. The chicken will outlast the Eiffel Tower in the physical record of this planet. And I don't know why that gets to me as much as it does, but it really does. But okay, let's go further. Because the genuinely interesting question isn't what happens in the first 1,000 years. It's what happens in the millions. Within 10 million years, the surface evidence of human civilization is essentially completely gone. Eroded, subducted, chemically broken down, recycled by the planet's geological processes, the same way it has recycled every other layer of rock and sediment that came before us. The continents will have shifted measurably. New mountain ranges will be in early formation. The species alive on the surface will be almost entirely unrecognizable compared to today, because evolution will have been running for 10 million years in our absence, and 10 million years is an enormous amount of time to generate new forms. To put that in perspective, 10 million years ago, there were no humans. There were no great apes as we know them. The ancestors of modern elephants looked different enough that you would struggle to confidently identify them. 10 million years of evolution produces radical change, and there is no reason to think the 10 million years after us will be any different. The descendants of the animals we know today will have become something else. The descendants of crows, which we already know are frighteningly intelligent, will have had 10 million years of selection pressure in a world without the dominant competitor that kept them in check. The descendants of rats, which are extraordinarily adaptable and already globally distributed, will have diversified into ecological niches that are currently occupied by us and by the larger animals we've displaced. The ocean, which we have significantly altered but not destroyed, will be generating new forms as it always has. Within 100 million years, Earth will look more different from today than today looks from the Cretaceous, which is to say completely unrecognizable, a different configuration of continents, a different atmosphere composition, a different biosphere running entirely different experiments with entirely different raw material. If you could somehow stand on that Earth and look around, nothing about it would tell you that humans had ever existed here. Not to the naked eye, not without instruments and knowledge and the specific intention to look. And here is the question that I cannot shake no matter how many times I come back to this topic. If something intelligent evolved on Earth 100 million years after us, and they developed science, and they started investigating the geological record of their planet the way we investigate ours, would they find us? Would they find enough to know we existed at all? The honest answer is maybe, possibly. In fragments that might not be interpretable, they would find the chicken bones, widely distributed, anomalously uniform in morphology, appearing suddenly in the record and then vanishing, a signature of something that doesn't fit the normal pattern of natural species distribution. They would find certain synthetic polymers that are durable enough to leave a detectable chemical trace in sediment layers across the geological record. Not the plastic objects themselves, those will have physically broken down long before 100 million years, but the chemical signature of their decomposition products absorbed into the sediment. They would find a thin layer of concrete aggregate in certain deposits, the remnant signature of the billions of tons of concrete we poured across the surface of the planet over about a century of intensive construction. They would find elevated levels of certain radioisotopes corresponding to our nuclear testing era, a brief anomalous spike in the record present globally, appearing and then fading within a relatively short geological window. They would find what geologists already call the Anthropocene boundary layer, the geological signature of a species that burned through hundreds of millions of years of stored carbon in about 200 years, that altered the global nitrogen cycle through industrial agriculture, that moved more rock and earth through mining and construction than all the world's rivers combined, that left a chemical and isotopic fingerprint in the sediment record of every ocean on the planet. They would find the signature of something that happened, something large and brief and globally distributed that changed the chemical and biological character of the planet's surface in ways that took millions of years to fully absorb and normalize. But whether they would recognize it as the signature of intelligence, of civilization, of a species that built cities and wrote music and developed mathematics and looked up at the night sky and wondered what was looking back, that I genuinely don't know. The evidence might be present and completely uninterpretable without context, a strange anomaly in the record, a layer that doesn't fit the pattern, something that makes their scientists argue for decades without resolution. Which is, now that I think about it, exactly how we talk about certain anomalies in our own fossil record. And here's the layer underneath all of this that I think about more than anything else when I sit with this topic long enough. The Earth does not need us. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Of course, it doesn't need us. It existed for 4 billion years before we showed up. But I don't think we actually believe it. Not really. I think on some deep collective level, we have convinced ourselves that we are so embedded in this planet's systems, so central to how it functions, so necessary to its continued operation, that our absence would leave some permanent, unfillable wound in the fabric of things. Pripyat says otherwise. The wolves came back, the forest came back, the river came back cleaner than it had been in decades, not despite the absence of humans, but directly because of it. The planet did not mourn. It did not pause. It did not leave a space in the shape of us and wait for us to fill it again. It just continued, doing what it has been doing for 4.5 billion years before we arrived and what it will do for billions of years after we're gone. Running the experiment of life, trying combinations, filling every available niche with whatever is capable of filling it. Generating complexity and diversity from chaos with the same patient, indifferent creativity it has always had. We are one combination, one experiment among millions that this planet has run and will run. One chapter in a story so long that our entire existence, from the first stone tool to whatever comes last, occupies less space in it than a single sentence occupies in a novel. We were loud and we were fast and we changed things in ways that will leave a trace. But the story does not end with us. It doesn't even pause. And I've been sitting with that for a long time now, and I genuinely still cannot decide if it makes me feel small or free, if it's a loss or a relief, if the correct response to understanding our own insignificance in deep time is grief, or something closer to peace. Maybe both. Maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe the most honest relationship you can have with this planet is one that holds both of those things at the same time without needing to resolve them into something more comfortable. The Earth was here before us. It will be here after us, and it will be fine. I think about that more than I probably should. Thanks for watching. And until next time on EvolveZoo.